Definitely.
So, and it's interesting too, like, obviously, you had the technological, limitations that kind of influence that and how it changed composition styles. But I think a large part of it comes down to, what those differences also offer as benefits too. I mean, Dan, you could probably speak to this more than I can, seeing as there's not as much on the drumming side when it comes time for some of the video game music without having to play it in the background. But, if you had to not typify, but kind of describe like maybe a difference in benefit you get from, let's say, learning a piece of video game music versus a piece of classical music. Can you put one into words? Can you codify it?
Oh man, that's one of those things where, for me, the line is so blurred between the two that so many of like standard music theory conventions. Like I said, I was sitting there in theory class learning about secondary harmonies and things in a classical context, and being able to directly draw distinctions and make comparisons to video game soundtracks that I grew up with, and not even just Super Mario. That's just the easiest example because he's kind of a household name now. But even looking at other franchises, I mean, when I was a senior, finishing my theory degree, I presented my final thesis on music in the Legend of Zelda series, which is another we haven't even touched. I mean, we mentioned a few games and tracks
Oh
here and
yeah.
there, but
Oh, we'll get there.
that's another library of works by the same composer, Koji Kondo. And I remember I decided to use the Legend of Zelda games specifically for my presentation because you can trace back pretty much from the earliest generation of 8-bit chiptunes to now getting fully orchestral scores. So I was able to pull from a lot of different examples from a very long-standing franchise. It's just on the verge of celebrating its 35th anniversary.
35th. Yeah, I think it'll be 20.
Yeah,
Is it
2021.
2021 or 2022?
Yeah, 21 because
Is
I
it
think
86?
I think it released in 1986 in Japan. I know it
Gotcha.
was 87 in the States, but
Mhm.
yeah, anyway.
But no, I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, the Legend of Zelda franchise is an amazing entrance to classical style music.
Mhm.
And I mean, you and I will have our arguments about like which field theme is better with like A Link to the Past versus like, Ocarina of Time versus Twilight Princess.
Mhm.
I love them all,
Yeah,
but
me
I mean,
too.
I'm still partial to Ocarina of Time because
Yeah.
that's me.
Well,
But
for a lot of people, that was their first Zelda game, and
yeah.
there's especially for us gamers, there's the nostalgia factor of like, all right,
Mhm.
if this is like you get that first impression of seeing these games for the first time when they released in the day when you're a child and you're very very impressionable, like those games are going to have that much more of a lasting impact on you musically, visually, experientially, if that's a word.
It
Um,
is.
okay, good. Don't want to make a complete fool of myself, but
Well, I already did that before with the harmony thing.
oh, it's okay. I think messing up one obscure chord in a piece of chip tune is a little less offensive than saying a word that doesn't exist. So,
It's all right. I'll sneak the word
but we
strategically.
digress.
Of course. But
So,
no, you're right. I mean,
yeah, I have
there's
a hard time
so,
drawing the line. I really can't.
okay. No, and that's a perfectly valid way to put it too. I mean, I find a hard time drawing a line just because, excuse me. I have to learn how to drink water. Um, so like I was saying, I have a hard time drawing the line too, just because of how close these game soundtracks are to these individual different styles. And the fact that they're not derivative of, but born out of those traditions
Mhm.
means that they're really not all that different. They just
No,
don't get
not
the
at
same
all.
hype. Like, okay, it, I gotta think of a good example here. Um, Thinking of something like, learning the Maple Leaf Rag versus learning the athletic theme from Super Mario World. They're both ragtime pieces. They're both rags on the piano, basically.
Yeah,
But
complete with their own strains.
which one is typically going to be seen as more legitimate, just because it's got
Maple Leaf
80
Rag.
years on it. Yeah, just because it's got 80 years on it. But they're of the same style. They're a similar situation.
Yeah, they're almost structured identically too.
Yeah, and the funny part is that like there's again quoting another YouTube channel here. I don't know if it's necessarily a channel, but there was a pianist, a ragtime pianist by the name of Tom Breyer, I believe was his name.
Oh
Had
yeah,
a bunch of videos of him
of him like sight
basically,
reading
yeah, sight
printed
reading like
versions of
Super Mario
video game
World music,
tracks.
and
Hmm.
it's like this is awesome to see this in real time with like a true ragtime pianist interpretation
Yeah,
of what it should sound like, which is
and it's
like
pretty much spot on to what it is in the game. you
which
know.
only goes to prove like how legitimate the composition was to the actual style. It wasn't just like a poor imitation. It was something that was studied and researched and implemented with the technology available at the time, but
Mhm.
yet can still hold up on its own when you hear it played by performer on an instrument, a real instrument. So that part was always impressive to me.
Mhm.
Um, I think one of the moments where I finally had the realization about how legitimate the Legend of Zelda's music was in like the early 2010s, when there was a project by the name of Zelda Reorchestrated that took all the old games and put them into high-end sound libraries, or actually outright recorded them later on with the Twilight Princess soundtrack.
And that was all
And you
pretty
hear them
much
like,
fan-made, right? Was that just
what?
a bunch of fans that put that site together?
Yeah, it was basically a labor of love, putting that together. And you hear it and
I
you're
can
like,
respect that.
this sounds like it came straight out of a movie soundtrack. And
Yeah.
it's awesome. I've used it to teach before. It's always great. Like I'll never forget one time using like the Battle on Elden Bridge soundtrack as like just teaching like how to describe a piece of music that sounds menacing, and
Mhm.
like finding ways to describe what makes it sound scary or menacing, or that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
it's really cool too, because it's even better when the students you're teaching it to don't know what it's from, and they're like, yeah, it sounds like it's from a film soundtrack. I'm like, yeah, it certainly does.
Yeah. And
And
that's a whole different topic of comparing film scores to game scores,
oh
because
yeah.
they often get lumped together because they're both multimedia forms. But
Mhm.
I definitely made a case for this when I was studying it in college, that they really could not be more different. But they sometimes get lumped together
Mhm.
for, because it's all right. It's a piece of music that's specifically designed to go with an image on a screen.
Right.
So there's that parallel you can draw, but that's pretty much where the parallels
That's
end
about it.
and the differences begin.
They do have they have some similarities in terms of the, not the affect, but sometimes the role that they perform.
Yeah,
And
especially on a lot of modern mainstream games that are more focused
cinematic.
on cutscenes and more cinematic, right?
Mhm.
So like there, it's like, all right, you're literally applying a film score to this scene that permeates the games. Um, and like I said, the more cinematic the game gets, the more closely drawn to a film score that soundtrack can be. And I'm
Right.
sure you could probably cite even more examples than I can of that. Things like
Oh.
Assassin's Creed or The Witcher
Mhm.
or God of War. These games that are punctuated with lots of cutscenes, and
Mhm.
not that that's a bad thing. It's one thing that makes the
No.
games so attractive to the audiences that attract them. But um, yeah, you get these like fully written and often orchestrated bits that go with a specific scene of events, and it's timed exactly to the scene on screen.
Well, the funny part is that, yeah, exactly. You do have that happen a lot, which really kind of amps up like the immersion factor to what
Mm,
you're playing. But I think the interesting part is that we talked about that split in like the mid early 2000s, um, where like soundtracks started to sound close enough to being real, or were real instruments, coincided with the advent of games more geared towards being more cinematic because the hardware could handle it. And we're
mhm,
talking like 2008, 2009 era. At this point, you mentioned Assassin's Creed, which the first one takes place during the Third Crusade down in Egypt, but then you also have the most acclaimed one out of the series, which is Assassin's Creed 2. It takes place in Renaissance Italy, which is amazing just for the historical realism. But it's really cool to hear music being something that's not quite so in your face, but really is meant to support rather than to be an active participant in the room,
yeah.
which is interesting because that is an interesting change compared to what myself and what Dan were used to from our childhoods, where the music was just as much of a present part on the screen as the actual gameplay itself. Whereas, like, if you played the game without any, any soundtracks for the earlier games, it would have been like, this is missing something. This doesn't
Yeah.
sound right.
Yeah, music is a pretty important part.
Right. And a lot of that is because the music kind of made up where the technology couldn't necessarily flesh out everything that they would have wanted to do, because there was a limitation. Now, when the hardware got a lot stronger, the music took a back seat more, which is interesting because you mentioned you working on your thesis for this. I believe it was a presentation for it, when you talked about the concept of dynamic scoring.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah,
So,
we could totally
Dan,
go
do you
there.
want to explain this? You're the one that wrote the presentation on it.
Well, yeah, so, I don't know if this is exactly something that I am the first to have coined the term, but this was something I basically created as a term of, dynamic scoring basically means, let's say, I use The Legend of Zelda as an example. So you have, it's set in this medieval fantasy theme, and you play as basically a knight, for lack of a better term. I'm just going to assume that the audience has never seen or heard or listened to a Zelda soundtrack or never played a game and doesn't know anything about the characters or story. So let's say, so you're this basic knight and you're going around this big open field of world to explore, and there's a set orchestral accompaniment to the adventure itself. But that, and this is where video game music gets a lot
Diverse.
different from
Mm-hmm.
film scores, because there's a number of different scenarios that can pan out because of the interactive nature of what a video game is. In other words, on a film, the main character has a set course of action and he's going to always do the same thing every time. But when you play a game, that's part of what makes for
The
things like
experience is different every
replay
time.
value, is
Mm-hmm.
you can go a different direction every time, and what can result is a different outcome.
Right.
And let's say you go and you explore this region and then you find like this cave, so there's basically like, there's oftentimes as many as 5 or 6 different layerings of the same basic musical material,
Mm-hmm.
but set to be in these different contexts. Okay, the character is on the field, the character is underground, the character is underwater and swimming, the
Mm-hmm.
character is riding on horseback or going on foot. Especially an example of that is Super Mario World, when you get the little
When you get
travel companion Yoshi. Whenever you're
and
riding on Yoshi,
bongo.
they add in bongo percussion to
Yep.
all the game's tracks, and as soon as you dismount, the bongos go away.
Yep.
That's a really simple example of what
That
I
was one of the
call
first ones
dynamic
I ever
scoring.
did.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the earliest examples I think you could find. I'm sure there are 8-bit ones as well. I just can't think of off the top of my head. But
Mm-hmm.
going back to like the more 3D, like kind of open world experience of something like the Legend of Zelda, there's also differences of when there are enemies afoot. Then the music is reflected to change. Now you're in a tense situation and it's dangerous. So and oftentimes there's all of these layers are programmed to be on play simultaneously, but you only hear whichever one
Kind of like
the
adjusting
scenario.
sliders on like a
It's
board.
like, it's exactly what it is, and it
Mhm.
creates that literal dynamic experience of, the music is constantly changing based on what I'm doing in the game. And that was something I always found really, really interesting. And there's a lot of examples of that happening in especially the 3D Legend of Zelda games.
Mhm.
You know, and even in cases like boss battles where you're fighting these giant monster creatures, when there are different stages of the fight,
Mhm.
a lot of times those are scored with dynamic scoring as well. Especially in a lot of the games that have this iconic kind of final climb up the towers of the castle, where the higher you get, the more menacing the music becomes and the more layers and orchestration goes into it. I did a whole example. I used, of course, one of my favorite Zelda games,
Twilight
Twilight
Princess.
Princess, as an
Mhm.
example of that when I gave the presentation in college. And I think it was used to great effect. I was really happy with how the presentation went that day. It was really fun. And especially, I got to just stand up in front of a class full of professors and colleagues and talk about Legend of Zelda music. It was so easy to just get up there and talk. It
It's
was
like,
great.
we're sure you put all this time and effort, and it's like, I've been studying this for my whole life.
Yeah, pretty
I just
much.
got up out of bed and put a suit on.
Pretty much.
But no, I
That
mean,
presentation was not really that often rehearsed.
I think
But
you make a great point though. I mean, the concept of kind of like changing sliders around as the situation changes is where it completely diverges from film soundtracks.
yeah, because
When
every
you watch a
composer for a game has to have like those different variations in mind when
in
they're
mind.
composing their source material.
And I think
Right.
the example you were, if I remember correctly, the example you gave had to do with a part of the game where you are basically not scaling, but working your way up the castle, the central castle in the region, which has been taken over by the bad guy in the game. And when you first enter it, it's a very quiet kind of background tune with a very faint melody.
Mhm.
But as you work your way up the tower, you start to hear that main boss's theme just trickle in. And the higher you
Yeah.
get, the more you hear. Eventually to the point where you're about to face him, and the original one is completely gone, replaced by his theme, which is impressive.
Yeah.
But it also
It's
never,
still an experience. I mean, I just recently played through that game
Mhm.
for like the third or fourth time, and that part still gives me chills. When the further I go up that tower, like it's something you can't explain. It's a feeling that you can't, and not to knock film scores, because
Mhm.
film scores is a whole different art form and it's equally remarkable and equally
Right.
amazing, if not more so, because it's got a longer history and more development time. But um, I've never felt that way watching a movie that I do when I'm going up that tower while playing the game. I
I've
never
only put
quite
one
feel the
series,
same
but you
level
know
of
what the
tension.
series is.
Well, yeah, and again, a part of that can be nostalgia too. I
Mhm.
grew up playing these games, and other people grew up watching movies,
I
so
grew up
that's
watching.
where we're different. And you grew up doing a little bit of both, so
That's true. And it's actually funny. I should even mention Star Wars because what got me into it wasn't the films. It was one of the first, not the first, but one of the games on the N64, Star Wars, which was Rogue Squadron, which was
Oh yeah.
hmm And as a soundtrack, the game's soundtrack was kind of based in the style of John Williams' soundtracks for the films, but didn't really borrow all that many themes from it, except for on a few occasions. And
Mhm.
it was interesting because that was my first instance of hearing somebody take a concept of a source material but run with it on their own. But it was very different because it wasn't like other game music I had heard. There was music in the background, but again, it wasn't as much in your face as it was like other games of that era. So even when you're talking about things related to like different film soundtrack styles, I mean, there are tons of games for the Lord of the Rings series,
Mhm.
which now I can't speak personally to them because I'm not a huge Lord of the Rings fan, which I'm sure is due to draw the ire of some people watching this.
Yeah, that's
Even
okay.
though the soundtracks are fantastic and the films were very grandiose when I watched them, it's just not wasn't always my thing.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
but at the same
it's a
time,
bit of an acquired taste.
exactly. But at the same time, those games, like there's tons of like in the Middle Earth series. There's a lot of those games in which the soundtracks are meant to, basically bring out the feeling of watching the film, except now you're in control of it. And what you do changes the music too. It's basically like watching a film that you control where the pace of it is at,
You get to take
which
part
also
in what
controls where the
happens.
music is at.
It's
Yeah,
always what I preferred. I'd rather spend 6 hours playing a game than spend 6 hours watching a movie marathon because it's a lot more interactive
true. And the thing is that I think that interactive nature of the music itself sometimes makes it a little bit more difficult to
to like
teach in general.
present on its own as like a
Yes,
separate
and
thing
I
because
think
it's
that's
directly integrated into the game.
right.
That's
I find
definitely a big
myself
part of it.
no, and you're, no, you're, it's a huge part of it. I find myself using like generalized examples from certain games as a means
Mhm.
to kind of show like things from different styles. Like, okay, great example, and we haven't even gotten to this franchise yet. Dan, if I told you to give me a modern day video game soundtrack example of Gregorian chant, what comes to your mind?
Oh, of course, Halo Combat Evolved on
Right.
the
When was
Xbox
the last time Gregorian
2001.
chant was relevant before then?
Probably the Middle Ages.
Right. And the thing is that, like, if you wanted to give somebody an example of Gregorian chant, you could play them Gregorian chant. But if you
Sure.
want to give them an example that's going to be like, oh, I know what this sounds like, and I like this too, you play the Halo soundtrack.
Yeah, of
And the
course.
thing is that, like, I think that's where video game music basically earns its stripes or earns its wings, so to speak, is that
Yeah,
serves as a
it's really
fantastic.
versatile and diverse. It could wear a lot of different hats.
It wears a lot of hats, and it also does a great job of bridging a great number of previously unbridgeable gaps, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you had, you were teaching, let's say, a class of sixth graders, seventh
Mhm.
graders, those who were fairly into video games, and let's say, for the ease of talking about this, they were all fans of the Legend of Zelda series because
Okay.
that's going to make the example easier. Um, so let's say, in general, you had some kids who, like that particular franchise, and you want to talk about classical music, but if you drop them right into talking about Beethoven and Mozart and Bach, you're going to get, uh-huh.
Yeah, it's gonna be a
Oh,
snooze
yeah, he
fest.
was born in Germany. He played Fair East. That's cool. Let's watch this film about him now. But if you kind of work your way in by starting with those video game soundtracks, it gets the wait. We don't talk about video games in any other class. This sounds like it might actually be entertaining. Um,
Yeah.
so that initial step is a means of drawing students' attention in, of getting them to invest. And once you got them invested, that's the time to start, teaching like all this stuff comes from these different places. Now let's take a listen to where those composers drew their influences from. And that's a really awesome way to bridge that gap. I know both, like, John Williams soundtracks did that, as well as video game soundtracks for me for classical music,
Mhm.
because growing up as a percussionist, uh, I was not a big classical fan for
Yeah.
a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there's so much music that's not for you
yeah,
as a
and that,
percussionist.
unless I want to play like two notes on two timpanis, like
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah,
But
exactly. That's pretty much
and
all that
I
Beethoven
and I
gives
don't
you.
mean to denigrate it either. It's just the fact that,
Right.
like, your instrument that you play very much winds up dictating what kind of music you will wind up being immersed in or surrounded by.
Yeah,
Like if
that'll
you play
definitely influence your musical tastes.
exactly, like if you're playing a string instrument or you're learning how to play a violin, viola, cello, bass, you are going to run up against a huge amount of classical music versus somebody who, you know, grows up learning trumpet, or somebody who grows up learning how to play piano, or somebody who grows up learning how to play the harp. You know, that you're going to wind up running against a totally different set of music. And I think
Mhm.
the one thing video game music does great is it kind of bridges these gaps to allow you to help students realize, like, hey, there's
Yeah.
this other type of music that's interesting that kind of influenced what I like, so maybe it's worth giving it a shot.
Yeah, and it's definitely a creative mixing and matching of different instruments to different styles. And I think a big part of that is the original lack of technology that
Hmm.
like, all right, well, the best sounding thing we have on this 16-bit chip is strings. So even though it stylistically wouldn't make the most sense to use strings, we're going to
Hmm.
do that because it just sounds the best.
Yeah.
And then you get some really unique instrumentations, orchestrations, arrangements, things that you would never see in any other genre. And a lot, it's funny how many of the most iconic things that define these video game characters and icons, most of it is attributed to technological limitations, you know.
Yeah.
And that's not even just talking about the music, that's talking a lot about the visual side of
Mhm.
it as well, you know. Like I remember, of course I was a big gamer geek, and like when the internet first kind of blew up, I spent all my free time just researching stuff about games and learning more about like their development and, you know, things that were kind of unique and trivial about them. And I remember reading this one article that was talking about like how Super Mario got his design, like why
Mhm.
he has overalls and why his shirt is red and why he has a hat. And it's because, oh, well, there weren't enough pixels to animate hair. So they just put a hat on so they didn't have to bother with it. You
Yeah.
know, overalls so that you could see his arms from his legs on this little 8-bit sprite on an arcade cabinet. Like every aspect, and that's just one example. Every aspect of the character's design is directly attributed to technological limitations. And I think that is just as true for the music. And we talked about that a little bit with, you know, some of the advanced like harmonization techniques that, you know,
Mhm.
composers used to make their music more solid and more interesting and more musically coherent. And I think that also stems into just how stylistically diverse video games can be.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and
I
that's
mean, the
always
funny
what
part
drew
is,
me to them a lot, is because you could just go on like 16 different planets of existence just by bouncing from one game soundtrack to another,
oh
by
yeah.
bouncing from one system of sound libraries to another. You get a whole different world
Oh yeah,
of stuff you get
absolutely.
to
I
hear.
mean, we could talk for several episodes worth about the differences between like the soundboards for the SNES versus the Super versus
Which
the
we
Sega
definitely
Genesis.
will. We will certainly revisit this topic in the future and cover it in more detail. But this is more or less a
Oh,
general
general
kind of
overview.
overview of why it doesn't matter right now in a lot of education settings and why we'd like to change that.
Well,
So,
the funny part is you bring up that idea of like, okay, well, we'll use this instrument in this style because it's what sounds best. And a lot of people say, well, all right, well, isn't that like a square peg in a round hole? And I'd rather say it's like somebody took the square peg and filed it down so it fits the round hole. And really what it comes down to is that you wind up getting these unorthodox uses of different instruments or different combinations you wouldn't normally hear in, you know, different settings that make for some really innovative music that for some people they may turn the nose up at, like, you know, well, this doesn't sound like it's supposed to be together and this doesn't fit the style. And the rest of us are like, yeah, but it's really cool. It sounds awesome and the game is fun to
but
play.
you hear two notes of the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild soundtrack, and you know exactly what game it's from.
Right. And you know, and the funny part is actually that's a really good example too, because for a game series that has had its games pretty much defined by orchestral or, you know, orchestra friendly style music, now it's like minimalist music. It's like somebody turned over the
Yeah.
keys to Philip
Here's
Glass and said,
minimalist
Here,
French impressionist piano.
yeah, it's like
It's
somebody
like,
turned over the
what
keys
is
to the,
this?
yeah, it's like somebody basically said to Philip Glass, hey, we want you to like write the soundtrack for a Zelda game. Can you do that for us? He's like, yeah, can I use piano? Yeah, sure, why not?
All right, that is all I will use for 90% of the soundtrack.
Yeah, and that even in of itself, I think kind of represents a new direction for a lot of soundtracks. Now, that definitely the Breath of the Wild, you know, as a game itself is what, 3 years old at this point, 4 years
Yeah,
old,
it definitely broke shattered the earth when it released though. It greatly changed the gaming scene
right? Into
in a
basically
lot of
being,
positive ways.
yeah, and basically into being a soundtrack that took that the more minimalist approach that a lot of the newer games had taken, but put the music back in the forefront again. I don't think I've played a game that can give me a heart attack as much as hearing the start of the Guardian theme in that. All I have to do
Yeah,
is hear
just
this little
hearing
piano
like
dip
three
go,
notes on
oh,
the
sorry.
piano and you know you're in trouble.
And I'm like, the heart rate instantly goes up a good 10 or 15 beats a minute. I'm like, something's going to go wrong really fast. But
Yeah, no, I feel
that's
that.
impressive for a soundtrack to have that kind of power and reaction
Yeah.
for something that's not a full-blown orchestral soundtrack, at
Mhm.
least at certain
At least for
times.
the most part. Yeah.
Yeah, and
There
that's
there are moments where you have these
oh,
full
absolutely.
orchestral soundtracks and it's
Hmm.
amazing, but it's and I think for how sparingly it's used, that's what makes it have so much more
More
of its
powerful. Yep.
yeah, so much more of a stronger impact.
Well, I think that kind of I think that's what makes it interesting to listen to is because now we're getting to the point where a lot of these franchises are starting to have composers who weren't the original composers, and we're starting to hear different takes off of it. But
Yeah,
we're
which I
starting to hear
love.
like,
I'm
oh
very
yeah,
happy about that.
oh it's awesome. It's
Mhm.
great because like it's cool to hear somebody's take off of a previous source material instead of it being the same thing done. Just like, hey, let's do this, but now in jazz. Let's do this
Especially
now.
with a lot of the older franchises that have been around for a few decades now that are have a little bit more of this kind of illustrious grandeur to them.
Yeah.
It's really, really refreshing to see this next generation of composers take the music of these franchises in a really cool, creative new direction.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, no, you're exactly right. And it's going to be interesting to watch and see what happens with it. I mean, for me, the probably one of the best parts I enjoyed of Breath of the Wild was its soundtrack, just because it was sparse but immersive, which
Yeah.
is really great because for
It
those
so
that don't
perfectly
know,
lent itself to the game and the experience of
the
playing that
openness.
game.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is something we talked about when the
Hmm.
game first dropped, and we were both kind of taking turns gushing about the soundtrack. It literally breathes. It lets the game breathe. It's not this constant fanfare in your face of "You're the hero, you're the hero, you're the hero." It's like, no, you're just this like isolated dude out in the wilderness
You're a
trying to find
dude.
your way, and you just hear a couple notes on a piano and then nothing, and then a couple notes on a piano and then like ambient bird sounds, and it just draws you into this world, and
Oh yeah.
you can lose yourself in it.
Well,
I
I
know I
think
have.
that's the direction that it's heading, and I'm really interested to see like how that style evolves. But it just brings me back to the same point. I think it's such a great um, way as a gateway to teach students all these different styles of music, whether it be orchestral, like romantic era classical music, whether it's 1960s minimalism on a piano, or at least born out of that style, whether it's Latin music, whether it's jazz music, either from like the big band swing era or like your 1960s style. I mean, it's
Yeah,
impressive the reach that it has. I know, I've had students who have wanted to learn video game music before in the past, and the motivation is much,
it's
much
hard to
more.
match.
Yeah, it is hard to match that because it's like,
Some of my best players are just video game aficionados that they'll sit there and spend the time to learn this really difficult piece of piano music because it's in
mhm.
their favorite game and they hear it constantly and they
Oh,
just really
absolutely.
want to learn it because they really love the game.
You can't
I mean,
ask
it
for a
works for
better
me.
motive. You can't ask for a better motivating factor than that. And I would urge to, any teachers who may be listening to consider that fact because, that motivation is powerful. It's really powerful. Like it'll actually, get students to buy into what you'd want to teach them and what you want to share with them musically, because you're kind of meeting them halfway, but also finding something that is still just as legitimate as
Yeah,
what they
something
enjoyed
that still
previously.
has a lot of substance to it too.
Well, I think one thing I did want to do before we get to the good gripes segment um,
Mhm.
was to give some examples for those that may be listening of like some styles and some soundtracks or games to look into. And it doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, but just some, just some different styles that could be used for those who might want to research something to use for teaching. Maybe are you okay going by genre a little bit?
Yeah, that works. Or even I think the easier way to do it would be to go by game franchise.
Well, let's do that. Let's start with the granddaddy of them all. Let's start with Super Mario.
Yeah,
So,
so we've
I
already
mean,
touched on a lot of this.
yeah, I like Latin jazz, swing, big band swing jazz. Uh, oh God, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean,
Ragtime, pretty much like
yeah,
anything
ragtime.
under the umbrella of jazz has probably been done in a Mario game.
Hmm.
Especially now that the series has been around for over 30 years and has been on virtually every platform on the market, has been on mobile apps, has been on all kinds of marketing, has been, like Mario is almost better known to kids these days than Mickey Mouse. And that's saying something.
Yeah,
So
no
yeah,
doubt.
you could pretty much find anything jazz related in a Mario game. So it's a really good place to start breaking the ice.
Hmm. Well, we mentioned the Legend of Zelda series, obviously, as we talked about, or that does orchestral, fantastic, and minimalistic music too. Now with some of the newest entries in the series.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of minimalism, that that makes me think of the series Metroid.
Oh yes. Oh, I didn't even get to this. Oh man, I
Yeah,
can't wait to
you
talk
could
about
definitely talk a lot more about the Metroid music than I can.
it. Yeah, just in general, Metroid is kind of like a mix between like the Aliens franchise and I don't want to say Lost in Space because it evokes the TV show from the 60s, but it generally has that feeling of you're alone in space and the soundtrack reflects it, which means that um, more so than other games, the music itself is more kind of ambient sound, ambient noise. There are some themes, but they're very different than the franchises we mentioned already. And I'm not going to go too far in depth because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today, but I could definitely do that in the future. Um, so that one is fantastic. Pokemon is a great one, a ubiquitous one. That's a little bit harder to kind of nail down because every generation's game soundtrack is a bit different. They follow general rules, but it's not always quite the same. Um, I would argue that certain generations do a better job of music that could be orchestrated with an orchestra versus others which would sound better in a rock setting. Um, so there's tons there to go on too, and Pokemon's a far-reaching, far-reaching franchise across pop culture. Um, the Halo franchise. I know we talked about that briefly,
Yeah,
but
that's
Halo
kind of
does
like
like
a unique style in its own right.
everything.
How much different stuff it incorporates. So grand
Imagine,
orchestral scores, rock music, Gregorian chant,
and sometimes
ambient,
mixes all
chill
three.
jams, electronica stuff. It's kind of
Mhm.
all over the place. It's really, really different.
I think probably the most impressive part of that soundtrack for those games to me is the fact that it can mix like orchestral Gregorian chant and rock music all at the same time,
Hmm.
which is like mind blowing to listen to because it actually works. Um, so that's a great franchise. Oh God, there's tons of others. We didn't even talk about Final Fantasy. Um,
Oh God, how do we do an entire video game music episode without talking about the music in the Final Fantasy
I
series?
think it's because we both grew up as primarily Nintendo people.
Probably, yeah.
But I
I
mean,
didn't play my first Final Fantasy game till college, so that's probably part of it.
but even that franchise has tons and tons of music, anything from like orchestral, electronica. Oh God, there's tons of stuff.
Yeah.
We'd have to do an entire episode on it just to talk about it, just and pick one game, let alone like one of the 30,000 games in the franchise to pick from as far as soundtracks to look at. There's tons and tons out there. I mean, think about, and we didn't even get a chance to talk about Banjo Kazooie soundtrack at all.
Yeah, which is definitely one of my favorite. Grant Kirkhope is one of my favorite game composers, and he's still an active composer nowadays. But definitely, if you're looking for like really like kind of fun, goofy, cartoony music
Mhm.
that uses some really interesting, like really interesting uses of advanced harmony techniques, things like chromatic medians, things like tritone substitutions. It's a big part of the Banjo Kazooie series and all of the music within that. And then it's funny enough, Mr. Kirkhope has even gone so far as applying that to some other franchises too. He did score one of the Donkey Kong games as well, and
Mhm.
you could hear it sounds like banjo music. It's really really interesting.
I think he actually scored one of the recent like Mario games. It was like
He
a
did the
spin-off thing,
Mario and Rabbids Kingdom
Kingdom
Battle
Battle.
for the
Yep.
Switch. Yeah,
Which is awesome because like you start seeing these composers that are like the titans of the industry, and you start seeing like them have their takes on these different franchises. It's really cool to see.
yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
I'm just going back to my old college notes of all the research on video game music that I did for
mhm,
my final semester, and looking at some of the different franchises that I kind of put together like a list of
mhm.
like here's like a kind of all you can eat sample platter of like all things that video game music has to offer. And there's stuff from all different generations here. There's and we didn't even oh gosh, we didn't even talk about Sonic the Hedgehog.
Oh,
Oh
gee.
wow.
Oh, yeah.
A
Oh,
soundtrack that literally had the king of pop involved at one point
mhm.
in the composition of the music.
For Sonic
And
and
that
Knuckles, right?
yeah, a little bit. And that's a whole different story. And he's not actually credited because, like, as the game was being finished, all of the awful, nasty, scandalous stuff started coming out, and it kind of tainted the whole thing. But
Gotcha.
yes, Michael Jackson himself was involved in some of the music composition for Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles. Um, which for the and Knuckles game, they actually kind of rewrote a lot of the stuff to kind of further separate themselves. But if you
Mhm.
get just an empty vanilla Sonic 3 cart, you'll hear some of Michael Jackson's original stuff, and you could hear it. He straight up takes a lot of his beats and bass lines from some of his really popular songs at the time. And it's really cool to hear that stuff in a video game. It's just
Yeah.
nuts because it was never really nothing like they never had like at that point such an
Anybody with that
iconic
famous.
figure get involved with the making of a game soundtrack. It
Well, I
was
guess if you were
always,
going to go big, you might as well go big or go home, because at
yeah,
that
and they
time
went
he
as big
was
as
the
they
man.
could and
Yep.
kind of shot themselves in the foot in the process, but that's neither here nor there.
I mean, there's that.
But
There's
yeah, to tell you what, I'll share a link to this to this document because it's got a bunch of YouTube links to listen to the tracks, and
mhm.
it lists all the composers in order, and it has a bunch of different franchises. You know, Halo is here, Pokemon is here, Assassin's Creed is here. There's a Rockstar game, Red Dead Redemption, which is like a whole
Oh
like
yeah.
Wild West set kind of thing, which is really really fun. And there's some really cool composers involved with that. So yeah, there's just a plethora of really cool stuff, and we you know, and it's not even mentioning some of the franchises that we haven't even gone to. Kind of going off of the Metroid thing that you were talking about before, another franchise that does that really well is Dead Space.
Yep. Which is basically kind of the same principle that I talked about with Metroid before, but dial it up to 11 to borrow
Yeah,
Spinal
and
Tap's
plus it's
reference.
20 years later, you know,
That
where
too.
you have the technology to have a fully orchestrated soundtrack, aside from chip tunes. So it's really cool to see it. Like, here's the old school version with Metroid, and then here's what you could do with it today with a franchise like Dead Space.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so much. There's so much out there to use, and there's so much that a teacher could use for building a curriculum around this, and it's awesome. I could talk for a while, and I'd probably start gushing about it just like we have for the past hour or so.
Yeah, yeah, we'll
But
definitely have to kind of wrap things up. I guess I'll mention a couple others really quick. Let's see. I was just thinking about it. Which one was it? Oh, you know what? If you're looking for, you know, one of my own personal favorite game franchises, and largely in part because of the music, is of course Mega Man.
I knew I
Um,
would figure that would be one.
yeah. So, and Mega Man music is like
Kind of rock
straight
like.
up hard rock heavy metal. And it's designed just like, you know, 80s metal, and it's really cool to see, like, here's what a video game composer can do to create that kind of style
Mhm.
with the 8-bit sounds. And that's always been a big part of what that franchise is well known for, is just how good the music is. So that's also a pretty interesting one. Um, you could also, if you're looking for something a little more cinematic, you know, we've talked about some of the other like later, more modern franchises. We didn't mention Battlefield 1942,
Okay.
which has a lot of really iconic theming and, you know, orchestral accompaniment, just like a modern day movie. So those are a couple other examples of franchises that you can, you know, just to kind of get into some of these different styles and see what this overall overarching broad diverse array of video game music has to offer. There's something here for everybody.
Oh yeah.
And that's not even just a gross overgeneralization. There really is something on this list for everybody. And it's pretty extensive. It's like 6 or 7 pages. Wow. I forgot how much time I put into this.
Anybody who's looking for information, you're gonna find it. That's
Yeah,
the part.
absolutely. So
Well, I guess this is getting close to the end, so I figured I lead us over to the good gripes segment. And seeing as we're talking about video game music, maybe we should talk about, like, video game music misconceptions, or just general gripes with what comes along with the video game industry sometimes, how it's perceived. Dan, why don't you start us off?
yeah, I feel kind of pressured with this because I've already kind of gotten into some of mine during the rest of the episode. You know, like the common perceptions that it's not real music. You know, I can't tell you how many times I would spend like weeks like working out like some really difficult like piano rendition of like a Super Mario tune and like playing it for my family, and like, is this one of those Nintendo songs? Yeah, you got to learn some real stuff, man. It's like I spent weeks on this and it's really difficult to play. So like there's always that, you know, I always had that going against me growing up, and that's why I'm like a really strong advocate for video game music, and I use it exhaustively in my teaching, you know, which is a big part of, I think, what kind of draws my kids to me, is that, you know, we're all gamers and we get to talk about games and game music, and it's kind of fun. That can sometimes be problematic, but that's a whole different gripe for a different episode. But yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind, but I feel kind of
No,
guilty because
it's a
I've
couple of
already said that, you know.
No, it's still valid though. I mean, I know
Yeah.
mine is sort of along the same line. This is one of the ones that drives me nuts, and it's a more generalized one, is that video games are not looked at as works of art.
Oh, yeah.
And that means more than just the music itself, but
That's
it's really
everything. The story, the visual
exactly.
presentation, you
And
know.
I think that's a part that really drives me nuts the most, is that, like, okay, so this TV show and this film are legitimate, but this video game, which has a lot of the same cinematic qualities, had a larger amount of time and effort put into it, and has a much longer lasting impact on quite a lot of people. It, it
Is
doesn't count.
written off because it's a toy for kids. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a crying shame.
yeah, it's a shame, and that's something I urge those that are listening to rethink if you have that perception in mind. Although I get the feeling like quite a few people who are going to be watching this don't have that perception, but still,
Yeah,
um,
we
at
can't
the
make
same time,
assumptions about everybody.
something to think about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But that pretty much draws us to a close for today. Dan, any final thoughts to add?
No, like I said, I'll link. I'll put a link in the description for this list of links, and just kind of go down that rabbit hole and see if you could, if you're not familiar with any of this stuff, find something that works for you and find something that at least kind of turns you on to this sort of idea that there's like this whole wonderful world of amazing art out there that is just waiting to be consumed. And especially nowadays, a lot of these games are so very accessible. Even the more old school ones, you can find ways to emulate or get digital downloads, or a lot of modern systems have like retro things built in of, especially with Nintendo. Oh gosh, if you have an online subscription on Nintendo Switch, you can gain access to a whole library of original Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo Entertainment System games,
Oh
and
yeah,
now you could take them on the road in this little portable device. It's great. So if nothing else, just go listen to the soundtracks. Watch gameplay footage of somebody, like, watch like a speed runner do like a rip through a game, and like listen to all the music as you're going through it. If you don't want to spend a lot of time with it, that's a good way to start. So as I say so often with the Rock Talk show that we also do on this channel, just go out and listen to the stuff we're talking about and go check it out for yourself. And, that'll tell you more about it than either of us can.
yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, no matter where the music comes from, if it sounds good to you, it sounds good to you. It's
Yeah.
valid nonetheless. One thing I will say that I think we might put in the actual Facebook group as well. We kind of want to find out, and I know Dan would find this interesting as well, what game soundtracks or what game franchises whose soundtracks had an impact on you as a person, as a musician, as a gamer, as anything. Uh, it's an awesome discussion to have because you'll get so many people saying like, well, this one was really important to me, and this one was really important to me. So anybody watching, feel free to comment on that, and I think we'll put something in the channel, not in the channel, but on the
On
Facebook
the Facebook
group page
page.
as
Yeah,
well. And maybe ask about that because I think that'd be a really cool discussion to have.
absolutely. I would agree 100%.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching this episode of Teacher Talk with Doc Rocker. I'm Russ Downey, Danton with me today, and we will see you in the next episode. Have a great